what you said previously, because you've already started to talk about the trade war, there seems to be all in, and about Europe. What do you think will be the effects of this trade war on Europe, and how should EU respond? You've already mentioned we are Europe as a good thing. What else do you think Europe should do?
So, I mean, the basic thing about trade war is everybody's going to lose. The premises of Trump, the economic premises, are totally wrong. We will lose the most. He thought that the cards were in the U.S. hands, say in the trade war with China. The fact is, I think he was wrong. The cards were really in China's hands. Why? Because first, the goods, the reason he thought the way he did was that U.S. buys China exports more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to China. He has a mercantilist view of the world, which is a view of the world existing 2.5 centuries ago. And he hasn't learned any economics in the last 2.5 centuries. So that, is, but when you're looking at what are the relative cards, what's important here is, in part, what are how critical are the various imports and exports. The things that China imports from the United States, grains, sorghum, soy, it can import from Latin America. There's a global market. But the things that the U.S. imports from China, there's no alternative. We can't, they control, they're dominant in rare earths, minerals. We might eventually be able to produce iPhones, maybe, but we now don't have the engineers, we don't have the logistics, we don't have the supply chain. It will take years to create the manufacturing capacity that China has. And those who I've talked to say the task of doing it is so difficult. We may be able to do it in one area or another, but doing it across the board, not going to happen, or at least not going to happen very quickly. So that's why I say that in some ways, China is less reliant on the United States than U.S. is on China. But there's another dimension. What is the nature of the threat? For China, the concern is demand. Where will they get demand for the goods they're producing? Well, there's an obvious answer. China is now the world's largest economy in PPP terms, in purchasing power parity. And their domestic consumption and their domestic demand is relatively weak. The Chinese government has the resources and the know-how, and I think the political will, to increase the domestic demand. And so substituting foreign demand for domestic demand is not easy, but it's not that difficult. But we have a supply problem and a demand problem. Substituting the supply from China is very difficult and will happen only slowly. And so he wants U.S. to start producing. It might happen in some areas, but it will happen not overnight. And in the meanwhile, there's enormous stress on our economy. And that stress is creating a demand problem and a supply problem because, as I said before, people are lack of confidence, consumer confidence, investor confidence. There's another, there are many other aspects of this trade war.
So basically, you think that America is the biggest loser?
Oh, I think the U.S. is the biggest loser, and
sorry, and what about Europe?
So
what is Europe doing in this
so
equation?
I think China's response was predictable, and the fact that the U.S. did not anticipate it is just another example of the danger of having an authoritarian leader, where other people aren't checking him. How could China come to the U.S. government on its knees and beg for a better deal? There's no self-respecting major economy, a government that would be willing to do that. And especially after the history of China, of the opium wars, the concessions, the treatment in the past of the west of China, in its history on trade. To me, it was inconceivable that China would do what Trump wanted him to do. So the fact that China, knowing that the cards were in China's hands, that they would respond the way that they did is what I would have thought was predictable. And the fact that he didn't predict it is a very big strategic blunder. So about Europe, I believe people in Europe are debating, should they try to be conciliatory or should they be tough? And I think my observation of Trump is that you have to be tough. He only respects people that stand up to him. And if you don't, he tramples you. And the universities are learning that slowly. What happened at Harvard illustrates. There was a demand from Harvard to do this and that, and they said yes. I thought they had gone too far. But when they agreed to do this and that, they then said, that was just yesterday's agreement. Now we want you to do all these things to give up your academic freedom. And it was at that point that Harvard said, no, we can't go that far. Europe will learn the same thing. If you give in, tomorrow they're going to ask for more. One example. They're asking countries all over the world to give up the digital tax. Who should determine the right of what taxes to impose? Should U.S. determine it, or should your own country determine it? To me, the answer is obvious. What you tax should be a matter of your decision. There is a level playing field that, if you tax a foreign company, you have to tax the domestic company in a fair way. That was the WTO rule. But the irony is that he's now destroying all those WTO rules. There was a big fight, I remember it so clearly, about whether foreign governments could subsidize their own movies to try to create a domestic movie culture. And American film industry, Hollywood, said, no, you have to have no subsidies. The French cannot create boring movies. They can't subsidize their industry. They can't do what they want. So that was in the WTO agreements, those kinds of things. But now, what does he propose? Saying that movies have to, foreign films are going to be not allowed or taxed coming into the United States. So all the principles that were created over 80 years, he's destroying. So the answer is you cannot let this guy who doesn't believe in the principle of rule of law, of symmetry, of fairness, dictate. He's going to demand that you abandon your Digital Service Act, the Digital Marketing Act, your protections of privacy. You cannot let the United States dictate your domestic policy. And so if that means in the end that you are going to have more conflict, you just have to be prepared for that. Europe as an economy is larger than the United States as an economy. So you have the resources that are able to create your own supply, your own demand, and you don't need to be dependent.
So tough answer.
What?
Tough answer.
Yeah.